President Trump is hosting a social media summit today at the White House. According to a White House spokesman, a group of digital leaders will gather for a, quote, robust conversation on the opportunities and challenges of today's online environment.
So roughly 130 people are expected to attend. Groups like Turning Point USA, Students for Trump, and the Heritage Foundation will also be there. Notably missing, however, are major tech platforms like Facebook, Google, and Twitter. Joining us with her thoughts on the social media summit is political and social commentator Chen, host of Pseudo Intellectual on Blaze TV. Lauren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lauren, let's get into this social media summit right now. As I'm sure you're aware, there's been a long time concern of conservatives on social media platforms that they're being censored, that the rules are being unfairly applied to them. What's your view of that landscape right now as somebody who operates in the space?
Well, I think from everything we've seen from both the tech companies themselves, from our end as users of the platforms, and from independent journalists who have done investigation into the issue, that it's not a conspiracy theory to say that there are rules that are being unequally enforced depending on where you stand on certain issues. And I want to be clear, I don't think this is necessarily a left-wing versus right-wing thing. I think it's accurate to say that conservatives face the brunt of online censorship, but we also see a huge difference in how independent and mainstream media platforms are being treated. I mean, if you look at left-wing independent commentators, people like David Pakman, Sam Seder, Kyle Kalinske, or Tim Pool, who actually is going to the summit, they're still facing a lot of the problems that conservatives are in terms of like not being recommended with the algorithm, shadow banning perhaps, or not being recommended for searches because they're not part of these mainstream platforms. So this is a lot bigger than just left-wing versus right-wing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, look, it's pretty hard to suss out whether there is a sort of systematic bias here because they're very protective over what their algorithm is. They are very much lacking in any sort of accountability and transparency. Most of the evidence that we have is frankly anecdotal, which I understand it's hard to get anything else. But do you think, what do you say to people who are basically like, look, these are private companies, they can do whatever they want. They can have their algorithm favor whoever they want. If they prefer mainstream media, if they prefer the left, then that's their right.
Well, that's something we definitely hear a lot. And the thing is, I'm not one who's usually championing, yeah, we have to regulate this, regulate that. But when it comes, Dad, I'm on the thing right now.
I love this.
YouTube live, goodness.
Right.
But
for me, Lauren, it's my kids running in the shot, so I feel you.
I like it.
Yeah, love to have family around, but there are challenges. When it comes to something like a private platform, these companies aren't just your average private platform. They're given special benefits under Section 230 of not being held accountable for what people are posting on their site, right? They're being treated as platforms, not as publishers. So if I say something on YouTube that's defamatory towards someone, that person I'm talking about can't go and sue YouTube or Twitter or whatever the platform I've said it on because they're protected as platforms. But if they're going to be curating their content like this, enforcing a personal bias over who is and who is not recommended, over how search results come up, that kind of thing very much leads you to being a publisher, not a platform. So I think these companies can't have their cake and eat it too, right? So, I mean, if they're going to be, hey, private platform, you can do whatever you want, but they're curating content, then I think that leaves them open to legal action. And that's not to mention, we're seeing that there are actual instances where they're I'm going to come out and say it, interfering in elections, right? If you're someone who's campaigning for political office and you want to purchase YouTube ads, you have to declare that. But I mean, you can't say that it's election interfering for Russians to buy Facebook ads, but then say it's completely justified for Facebook as a private company to censor Trump supporters based on their ideas. You can't have it both ways.
I think that's an excellent point, Lauren. This is something Senator Josh Hawley's talked a lot about Section 230 in particular, and about if you're going to police the content on your platform, that means that you are taking an editorial judgment as to what has a place on your platform and not, and you're no longer neutral. And neutrality, I think, is the key of Section 230 for these platforms. Is that right?
Well, that's right. And there's obviously going to be issues when you're talking about terms of service, because a lot of people think we wouldn't necessarily be having this conversation if we were simply enforcing terms of service like, no threats or violence, right? I think there are some areas where everyone can agree, all right, you have some reason to moderate. But we're going a lot deeper than this, and I don't expect there to be clear-cut answers over like, yep, this is always okay versus this is not. And I think there's room for these tech companies to maybe push back a little bit about and say, hey, we have to have some control here. And that's a conversation we can have. But I think right now, and even Jack Dorsey himself, the CEO of Twitter, has come out and said that they're being right now way, they have rather been in the past too harsh with banning conservatives.
Yeah, because I guess that's the challenge is if you take the argument to the logical conclusion, they just have to be totally neutral.
Right. Then
that means that they can't decide at all what's allowed and what's not allowed on their platform. They can't favor any content, real factual information over fraudulent information, etc.
Well, I think that
so how do you draw that line?
Yeah, I was just going to say the idea that, they should be favoring factual information over non-factual information. I think that concept in particular, like I think there's a conversation to be had over what is, for example, overtly threatening versus hyperbole, on social media, Twitter. That can be hard sometimes. But I'm one of those people that don't think that Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube should be favoring, quote, factual over non-factual information, simply because I think in certain areas, it isn't so clear cut, right? I mean, it's very easy.
True. No, I was just using that as an example of, it's hard to draw the line. Obviously, they have some say as as these companies who are creating these platforms over how they run them. I think it's hard to find that dividing line. I mean, what would be the ideal answer in your mind?
Well, I think the first off is that I would say that the employees who are actually enforcing these rules, they have a huge political bias themselves. Of course, everyone does. I don't think anyone expects, the person who's who's part of Twitter's trust and safety team to be some sort of perfect neutral person with no biases of their own. That's just not going to happen. But I think it's important that within these tech companies themselves, they start to open up the conversation and the dialogue to a little bit more political diversity. Jack Dorsey himself has said that conservatives within Twitter don't feel comfortable voicing their own opinions or concerns because there's that overwhelmingly left-wing bias. I think it's very hard for a company that operates with such a huge slant one way to enforce rules evenly. And we see that in Twitter's terms of service. Misgendering is actually something that has gotten people banned. I'm happy to call people whatever they want to be called, of course, but you have to acknowledge that if misgendering is something that's worthy of being banned from Twitter, that's in and of itself enforcing a huge political bias in favor of one ideology over another. And I think if there was more conversation around these rules, that may not be the case.
That's a great point, Lauren, and you're getting to exactly the heart of it, which is it's the actual enforcement of where most of the bias is seen. We also wanted to get your take on there's a huge debate right now. We have the women's world soccer team parading in New York City, and a lot of discussion about equal pay for these team members. People who say that they should be paid at the same rate as their male counterparts point out that they had higher ratings, that they're actually winning the games.
Yeah.
What would be the counter argument against it, and really just what's your view?
Well, I think first off, I want to say huge congratulations to the women's team. I mean, it's a huge accomplishment, and I think so many people are very proud of what they've managed to accomplish. But in terms of the pay, I think we still have to realize that it's just a fact that the women's games don't draw as much attention as the men's games. And if we look at how these athletic, organizations make most of their money, it's from things like sponsorships and advertisement. And as someone who's on YouTube is aware of, those numbers, how much you get paid, they're tied directly to viewership. Go ahead.
On this particular, in this particular case, when you're comparing the women's and the men's U.S. team, the women actually generate more revenue, and we don't know exactly on merchandising, but right now the number one jersey in the nation, according to Nike, is the women's jersey. So based on the evidence that is out there, it appears that the women's U.S. national team earns more revenue for the U.S. Soccer Federation than the men do, even though they're paid less.
Well, I think those numbers might be debatable because overall the men's organization is just so much so much larger. So when the men's teams compete, even if they're losing, and obviously the women's rank so much higher than the men's team, they're still competing with a larger organization, a larger pool of viewers. And it's unfortunate to say that more people don't watch women's soccer, but they've actually done a breakdown of the numbers. And if you look at how much each team brings in, the women's team actually gets a larger percentage of the earnings that come in through their games than the men's team. So there have been people saying that, wait a second, they're actually being paid a larger percentage. It's not an easy thing to talk about, and obviously there are things like individual contract negotiations. I wish more people would watch women's like they do men's. It just doesn't look like that's the case right now, though.
So I think there's two different issues. There's the International World Cup, in which case you're correct. More people watch the Men's World Cup than the Women's World Cup. But when you're talking about the U.S. Soccer Federation and comparing the U.S. national women's and men's team, the women draw more viewers and they earn more revenue for the U.S. Soccer Federation. And that's what the lawsuit is about, is saying that those two teams are paid unequally simply due to their gender.
Well, I think when you say something is simply due to their gender, you have to be able to prove that the bias is not due to things like different attendance in stadiums, different like merchandise sales and all of that stuff. If it does turn out, and I want to be like completely fair here, if it does turn out that all else being equal, right, sponsorships, advertising, viewers, ticket sales, all that, if everything else is equal, then I say absolutely their pay should be proportionate to the amount that they bring in. I think that if they feel like they've been treated unfairly, they have every right to try to pursue legal action, and we can wait and see what happens. But I, like a lot of other people, think there may be more at play here.
Yeah.
Final question for you, Lauren. I know you took issue particularly with Elizabeth Warren's framing around that and leaving out Asian women in particular. I would love to get your take on that before we go.
Right. Well, as someone who is Asian, I'm half Chinese, I often find it interesting how when we're talking about the pay gap that exists between men and women, and especially when we apply an intersectional lens through it, where we're not just talking about gender, we're also talking about how race and gender play off of each other. Asians are often left out of the equation. And I think the reason that is because, men make more than women on average. And, if you break it down between white women, Latino women, et cetera, there's also that disparity. Black and Latino women don't make as much as white women, but Asian women they're an abnormality to the idea that to be white is to be more privileged in terms of how much you're paid. Asian men make more than white men, and Asian women make more than white women. So I and a lot of other people, Dr. Christina Hoff Sommers particularly, she's someone who identifies as a feminist, but didn't quite agree with how Elizabeth Warren was characterizing the event. I think it's a little bit disingenuous to leave out an entire group of people from the conversation, maybe because they don't exactly fit your narrative. But I mean, as someone who's Asian, I got to say, like, our numbers are relevant to the conversation. We exist. I don't think it's fair to leave us out of the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Lauren. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much. Great to have you.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Next up on Rising, more and more frequently, the climate change debate is incorporating younger voices who are leading protest movements around the globe.
Our conversation with one of those activists, a 14-year-old Alexandra Villasenor, about what motivates her as Rising rolls on.